and stick to. Okay, good. I'm going to try to stick to the slide deck only because if I can get the key messages out and lay the groundwork and give you background information that you need to make sense of the tables, then it will give me maybe 45 minutes of the presentation to go back and forth with you in terms of questions or looking at the data tables themselves. So I was going to stay on the slide deck for about an hour and then, or maybe a bit longer, and then get a chunk of time when we can do some question and answer and some discussion around the committee work over, well, what can we do with this data? And stuff like that. So if that's okay, I'll proceed with that agenda. By the way, I will open up the data tables at the end of the thing, if that's what my hope is, because then I can really show you the raw data and we can talk a bit more about how you might access it or whatever, or make sense of it all. All right, let's get started then. So first of all, I believe, this is a value system, that data is essential for agencies, schools, and police to achieve its goals and solve the challenges we face today. I want to say in the beginning, because I've been from the very beginning, by the way, I'm a very old consultant. In the beginning, the foundation of social services was very personal and not very data oriented. Social outcomes were the results of individual action by a teacher in her classroom, the officer on the street, the social worker with the parents. Today, effective social services throughout the literature and all the best practice and all the research today is defined as treating the underlying causes of adverse outcomes, violence, addiction, child abuse, etc. In a practical way, it means for the police, they've somehow got to find a way to treat the underlying causes of crime. Now, not just the police, but the whole systemic support around police. If we care about safety in our community, we have got to treat the underlying causes of unsafety. So this is principle number 1. Principle number 2 is we have to enhance, teach, and grow the social, cognitive, emotional capacities of children and young adults especially, which is the foundation of a civic society and of economic productivity and the foundation of good things happening for everybody. And both of these two things, treating the underlying causes and enhancing resilience, is based on data about how these causes operate to produce positive or negative outcomes. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. It isn't good enough to say we need to have data on the causes of violence. We have to go one step further. We actually have to know, well, really, how exactly does that produce violence? Like, what's the mechanism that produces the violence? Because that's what you can intervene in, whether you're a cop on the beat or a social worker or whatever, working around the system. So what that leads to is that data, we have to go one step past data. We have to talk about a strategy to amplify results. I want to say that there's a ton of research, and I can share any of it with you, that the results of social services as currently operated today, and by the way, I'm using a big definition of social services. That means school, police, children's aid, children's mental health. It's all of the mechanisms of society that hold society together and make it a good place to live. The results of social services as currently operated are actually very positive compared to decades earlier, due to professionalism, training, curricular development, policies, laws, and regulations. The entire systemic basket holding our social services together is much better today than it was decades ago, even inside the basket of children's aid societies. I used to work in children's aids for a long, long time. Inside the work of child welfare, the quality of the work, the results that people are getting is much better today than it was before. There are far fewer unintended bad outcomes or iatrogenic effects of the system as a result of it. So there's lots of data on that. We can feel optimistic about that. Sometimes I don't think the headlines cover that very well. By the way, policing is much better today than it ever was, too, just as an example of that side of it. There's lots of headlines about where it fails, very little public knowledge of the degree to which it's succeeding. We have to turn that table. If we want to start to make progress in terms of improving frontline behavior and capacity, we have to see what it does that really, really works, because that's what we have to shine the light on. That's what we have to put energy doing. But now the goal of EKIOC is to achieve even better results. I mean, I'm saying this is good stuff we're doing, but the goal of EKIOC is to achieve better results by maximizing the rule of targeting underlying causes and capabilities. So that means we're talking about the front line of police, teachers, and social workers are doing that now. We know they're doing that because they're getting better results. But we could sharpen this focus. A key EKIOC strategy is to secure data on the geography and the size of the causes and the capacities of the underlying population, and set up a coordinated strategy to target resources to the causes and capacities. In other words, to act systemically rather than individually. It's great that we got teachers that understand how the brain, how the actual functioning of the child's brain determines what they can do in math. I mean, they really do understand it. It's funny, but I talk to my teachers all the time, my friends. They don't just teach curricula. They actually figure out, they're working on child developmental goals. They teach kids emotional self-reflection, calming down, being respectful, listening, deep breathing, figuring out how to solve a problem. So in other words, and critical thinking. They're engaged in brain intervention with the kids in the classroom to a great extent, not just following the curriculum. It's interesting, by the way, but the curriculum doesn't contain the actual work of the teachers. This is the actual work of the teachers intervening with the brain. So we know that our front line is working on the underlying causes. The issue is, can we be more systemic about it? Is there some way that we could work together and reinforce each other's work? So I think that's the secret. We got to get out of our silo a little bit, and I think that'll amplify outcomes. The alternative strategy, by the way, to doing what I just described there, which I think is the mandate of EKIOC. By the way, EKIOC can disavow anything I say about you guys. I'm just listening to your words. I might be wrong. The alternative strategy of doing what I described above is to target resources at areas where adverse outcomes are rising. In other words, let's throw our police into the streetcars and subways of Toronto because that's where people are getting stabbed. And I think that's a crazy idea. I think that's less effective because that's chasing the horse after, that's closing the barn door after the horse is bolted. We have to be figuring out why people are getting violent in the subways and intervening with the why. Or we can't actually, there's not enough people to chase down the adverse outcomes. We have to get ahead of that and stop them from being produced in the first place. So that's my belief. I mean, that's a value system, and a belief system. But anyway, that's what I think. That's the alternative, by the way. And there's a lot of public pressure to go the alternative way. Everybody's calling. We need more police officers. Well, I always think that's a great idea. But the point is, what they want to do with them is chase after bad guys. This is not a good idea. This is a waste of police resources. And we always talk about when some kid dies in child welfare, we need more laws, more children's aid workers chasing after bad parents. This is a bottomless pit. This is like a black hole. So that's why I'm thinking that we need to turn the whole strategy around. Now, our agenda today is to describe the data. I'm going to describe the data for you. What's the data that I'm working with and how that could support that strategy? How will the members of the community access the data in the analytical report? So I'll answer that. I'll provide you with the definitions of terms used in this analysis and the logic, and I'm going to share with you right now the logic model for selecting and organizing the data. I've got 3 different subjects or chapters. One is the changing demographic profile of local communities, and that is all your local communities are changing all the time. The number of young people, older people, the whole the population is changing, by age cohorts quite a bit. And the profile of the families are changing quite a bit. The amount of income flowing into the families, flowing into our communities is changing enormously. And the amount of migrants moving into this community is really very dynamic. Some cities are really growing dramatically, others aren't. Some are shrinking, some are expanding. Some are going to really benefit from the migration, others are not. So that's the demographic profile. I mean, that's not about risk or mental health. That's just about how the whole nature of our community is changing. The second chapter is about risk, adverse outcomes, and resilience within the residents' population. And the third chapter is the Indigenous demographic and risk profile. So, Aaron, I'm going to give you a bit more data on the Indigenous population and lots of tables to talk about it. I'm going to deal with issues related to that today. So, the data side of it, the data is organized into 22 Excel spreadsheet files with 195 tabs and 6 or 8 columns each. So number one, it's overwhelming. I mean, I look at it and I think, holy crap, I can never make sense of this. This is, so it's intended to be like, you don't be overwhelmed yourself if you look at all this data and think, oh my God, I can't deal with this. It's intended to be, it's just all the data that I can assemble for you. And I selected something to talk about, but it is a lot of data and it's raw data. There are 3 Excel summaries, Excel spreadsheet files, which are called summary sheets, which are copied from the main data set. So the main data set is not duplicated. It's all individual columns of data that are all separate. And then there's 3 Excel summary sheets that I pulled together to kind of tell a story. The data itself is aligned with the province and 9 census divisions. There's about 53 rows in all of the Excel spreadsheets that you'll be looking at. I took that 53 rows from my computer, which I downloaded from Statistics Canada, which in many cases has 6,000 rows. And in the case of Ontario, well over 500 rows. So I did you a favor, hopefully, which is I reduced the data you're looking at to something that you can actually see. But I'll get back to looking at the whole data. If you really do want to see the whole data, I can tell you how to get it. The data, so I've got you a subset of data that it is aligned with what I call the local comparison group, which is made up of Prescott Russell, Sormel, Dundas and Glengarry, Leeds and Grenville, Lanark, Frontenac, and some outside comparators, Middlesex and Oakville, and on Ottawa, of course, which is a big glob in the middle of all this, holding this together. And I gave you that kind of a framework. The local comparison group, by the way, which is made up of Ottawa and all those other agencies I described, corresponds to the geographic boundaries of the Ottawa economic region. Just so that you know, there's 11 economic regions in Ontario. You are in one economic region, sort of Eastern Ontario economic region. Statistics Canada, by the way, gives you a lot of updated data by economic region. They don't give it to you by census subdivisions. They do that every 5 years. But in between, they give a lot of updated data by economic region, just so that you know. Okay, so that's the data. All the files, all these data files and all of my narrative reports and literature that I've given the committee are located with Geraldine Stark at the Brockville Library and Karen von Kramen at the EKIOC coordinator. Those 2 ladies have all the data. Geraldine has an index for each tab of the 22 main data files and the source of the data described. Most of the data is from one of the 4 census tables downloaded from Statistics Canada. There must be 60 census tables available to download, but I downloaded about 4 of them, and including the Aboriginal survey for 2016 and the surveys from 2011, 2016, and 2021. So these are the basic census surveys, for which basically include most of the data you're looking at. But there are other sources of data, which is documented in the index, including a lot of data from the public health units. An awful lot of the planning data you need is actually organized by public health unit, and your local public health unit are doing a great job. They're really the epidemiological heart and soul of people who love data. They really are epidemiologists at heart. And so thank God for them. They're doing a lot of really good work for the community. And however, that data is strictly at very broad boundaries, like Leeds and Grenville and Lanark is one public health unit. Most of the raw data, the counts in dollars, will appear on the data sheet simply as they appear on the source data. And I didn't do anything to them. I just copied them right into the Excel spreadsheets. Several new fields, however, were created by myself, which are combinations of counts and percentiles. Statistics Canada basically gives you raw numbers. They don't give you a lot of percentiles, but it's the percentiles that you need to see to make sense of the data. If you don't see the percentiles, you can't figure out, is this big or little? So I got that for you to make the data understandable. The formulas I used are visible on the Excel spreadsheet. So that way you can always figure out, where did Fulton get this stuff from? You can see it yourself. And you can disagree with it if you want. You could rearrange the data, put it together in a different knit it together in a slightly different way. So that's totally okay, by the way. This is public data, your data, play with it. But I just want you to know that my stuff is going to be visible. I try to be completely transparent. Okay, so let's talk about some definitions of terms that I'm using throughout to hopefully make sense of it all. One is that all of us talk about risk factors. Risk factors are the quality of an individual or a group of people which is causing the bad outcome. And I mean that literally, as in causing, as in putative, as in fire, as in pull the trigger on a gun and the bullet comes out the front end. These are scientific evidence that it's actually causing the bad outcome. The evidence for stating that the risk factor has the power to actually cause the adverse outcome is acquired through longitudinal and experimental research. There are 20 evidence-based risk factors in the data sheet. And in the database, I can identify them for you if you want later on. And and by the way, this is counter to public belief systems. Public belief, for example, says, if you do a bad thing, you made a bad choice. The whole basis of the logic model here is that bad outcomes are the end of a chain of events and along that chain of events are a whole bunch of causes which produce the bad outcome. So that the individual actor is not personally driving the bad outcome. Often they hate the bad outcome that they get to in the end rather than actually choosing it. That's not to say that people like Paul Bernardo don't actually cause the bad outcomes they produce. I'm not completely obsessive about it, but the vast majority of bad outcomes are not chosen willfully by the people that do them. Okay, so that's the first thing that's really important. And but this is counterintuitive for many people, but that's what a risk factor means. That's the thing, that's the bad thing you've got to get rid of, not the person who's involved in the chain of events that ends up in bad things happening. Let me give you an example. Well, I'll give you an example in a second. Risk, unlike a risk factor, is actually a probability statement about the relationship between the risk factor and the adverse outcome. And I'll give you an example. Heavy drinking in the 12th week of pregnancy increases the odds of giving birth to a child with FASD from 1% to 43%. That's a risk statement. Unfortunately, I don't have a similar risk statement for all of our bad outcomes. I would love to be able to tell the Children's Aid Society, I don't know, fathers that are caught up in hidden unemployment or haven't worked for years and are desperate and lonely will increase the odds of becoming a child abuser by 7-fold. from the baseline, but I can't do that. No one has that data. So we're missing a lot of risk data that would actually make our system more rational. By the way, all of that means is that AI is not going to replace Children's Aid Society very soon. We don't have the baseline data to do it. So, but anyway, that statement is accurate. They figured that one out. The most reliable predictor of bad outcomes, because we don't have good quality data like I've described above, like really precise data like that for most bad outcomes. The most reliable predictor of bad outcomes for children exposed to known risk factors is the degree of comorbidity. In other words, combinations of any given mix of risk factors are much more reliable predictors of bad outcomes. So for social workers or anybody who's working in this field, you know, you want to look at a group of people and you want to know, am I going to get casualties from this group? The answer is a whole basket of bad outcomes predicts, a whole basket of risk factors are much more predictive than one individual risk factor. The other term that I use is mediator. Mediator is the mechanism through which the risk factor causes the bad outcome. Poverty is one of the most potent risk factors in the community. Before we can deal with that problem effectively, however, we must understand how poverty enters children. Many scholars, especially Dr. Fraser Mustard, describe that poverty in early childhood damages the child's developing brain and other organs as well, leaving the child further and further behind his peers throughout childhood. And these primary changes to the child's development, especially inside the brain, are compounded by the child's social and emotional reaction to his stress, causing further adverse outcomes. So it becomes a chain of events. Poverty starts the chain by damaging the brain, and then this is accelerated by social and emotional factors. This research by Mustard teaches us to identify children growing up in poverty and fast track them into programs that protect the growing brain by doing such very simple things as supplementing their diet at school, providing access to early childhood programs to stimulate their social and intellectual development. In other words, like child care, like the thing that the government of Canada is doing is so important for kids at risk. These programs target the mediator directly and they're successful, even if we do little about the original cause. You have to understand that we need to know both the risk factor and the mediator. Effective intervention is often on the mediator because so often the risk factor is just something we can't change. So just keep in mind that the difference between the two mechanisms is very important for strategy points of view. The other comment, the other term is markers or at-risk groups. Qualities of certain groups that are correlated with adverse outcomes but do not cause them. This is important and counterintuitive from the mind of the public. Lone parent families, Indigenous people, Black people, LGBTQ people, all kinds of people that are demonized experience many more adverse outcomes, while white children growing up in a couple-led family, many more than white people growing up in a couple-led family. Variables such as race, ethnicity, family structure, gender identity are not causes of adverse outcomes, contrary to Governor DeSantis or DeSantis. It is what happens to these groups that produces the bad outcomes. These are called at-risk groups. So we also have to somehow protect the at-risk. We also have to protect the at-risk groups. It's very important to really delineate this thing from risk factors. Don't blame the group, blame the risk factor. Resilience is a natural transaction in the social environment, which directly counteracts the negative forces operating within the risk factor and thus prevents adverse outcomes from occurring. Resilience is a natural transaction. It's a transaction. It's not a quality. In other words, I can't stand it when CNN keeps talking about all these resilient people. Resilient is not a quality you have inside your body. It's not inside you. Resilience is not a good-looking dude. It's not even a smart kid. Resilience is an interaction between any kid, smart or not smart, between a good-looking dude and a bad-looking dude, and the people they interact with. It's a transaction, not a container, not a thing that you have, that you possess. Resilience data, therefore, is the state of interpersonal well-being and social connectedness, and personal well-being, which is social, cognitive, and emotional skills that allows you to interact with other human beings. So resilience is always a social construct. That's what makes it happen. I can give you tons of literature on that if anybody doubts it. There is a problem I find in the public forum that it continually makes resilience, it continually defines resilience as some sort of a money that you have in your wallet. It isn't like that at all. The most powerful form of resilience is a secure attachment, totally interpersonal. Other powerful forms of resilience are school bonding, able to succeed in school within the scope of your talents and interests, being socially connected, having someone to confide in, being and feeling safe in your neighborhood, and having enough opportunities and resources to pursue your goals in life. So that's what the hard research says is the most powerful forms of resilience. And so now let's talk about adverse outcomes. Adverse outcomes is the end of a chain of events that no one, least of all the individual actor, seeks. Adverse outcomes are not a choice freely taken, except in rare cases. This is true even if the individual actor reinforces the chain of events with dysfunctional thinking and negative emotions. People who carry the burden of adverse outcomes need external support, a hand up to escape the results. Unfortunately, mainstream culture tends to blame the individual actor rather than the chain of events or his social context. So anyway, that's what adverse outcomes is from my point of view. Let me just, the thing I want to talk about now, I want to switch to a new chapter. And is everybody okay with everything I said so far? Nobody wants to interrupt me and say, Bob, I disagree with everything you just said. You're all okay? Cool. Let's talk about the changes in our community. Demographics, a few findings. One, the mix of people making up individual communities within the local comparison group, and then a few communities will have a significant impact on the business of operating schools and agencies. So things are changing and they're going to impact your community. It is useful for each agency in this group to study the raw data tables, especially demographic table number 1 and family table number 2, to see the impact on their business. However, the following findings will have a broad effect on everybody. So I'm just acknowledging that there's a lot of differences between all the member agencies, and they're all going to look at different numbers to figure out the size of the population that's going to want to come to their agency. But the first big demographic finding that I saw was that there's a huge decline in mature adults. And later on, I can open up that table and you'll see it. The people in the age group 45 to 54 are disappearing. They are the group behind the baby boomers. The baby boomers are all older than this, and they're all rolling through retirement years. And before long, they're going to die. And actually, the retirement population is going to not grow so rapidly in the years ahead. I know we're all worried about that, but it actually is going to grow quite a bit more slowly because the baby boomers is the big population bulge that really ripped into that age group right now. And right behind them is a population depression. And that's the decline in mature ages, mature adults, 45 to 54. The age group 35 to 49 is also kind of small too, in a mini depression. And so this age group is not going to pick up for very long. You're going to have about 10 or 15 years of this depression to deal with. This age group is the source of expertise and management for the private sector, healthcare, education, and social services. The crisis in the number of nursing jobs unfilled and the number of ER hospitals being closed across rural Ontario will not be repaired by simply graduating more nurses, which is good news 20 years down the road. It takes years of experience to fill this gap. And this problem is being amplified by burnout, early retirement, and chronic disease. COVID has hurt this population of workers, and a lot of them are leaving the field. A lot of them are burning out because they're having to double up. You're having managers who would have one scope of practice, and they're having to, your directors are having to give them 2 or 3 times the scope of practice. And what's happening is that then they're burning out, and this is leaving a big hole in agencies. Plus, what's happening in frontline social work, especially, I know this, but I don't know about, but I know in policing, there's a real, they're struggling to hire police officers, but also we're struggling to hire social workers to work in children's mental health and child welfare. And part of the reason is the COVID, and people were working from home and they love doing it. And they're quitting because they don't want to go back to the office. And not only that, they're also leaving, and a lot of social workers are leaving and setting up private practice. And that is really hurting agencies. I just want to acknowledge that. And that's a little separate from ages 45 to 54, but it's even affecting that age group. Now, the decline in the mature age cohort is unevenly distributed. So that means this is a problem for many agencies, but not for all. Big cities are in much better condition. Ottawa is only losing 4%. It's down 4% in this population. Halton is actually up 5%. This age group is moving to Halton because they got more money. And Middlesex is down 7%, not so bad. In the Ottawa Corona, which is what I call STG, Prescott Russell, LNG, Lanark, and Frontenac, these guys had a combined 14% decline in this age cohort. So Aaron, this group is you're going to feel this decline in your agency. 8 rural areas out of 24 in the local comparison group had declines that were 20% or higher. So this leaves a big hole in that population. 9 population centers in the local comparison group had a decline of 16%. Only Carleton Place was the exception. In general, small towns and rural places carry the burden of this risk factor. It's a risk factor because it is going to injure the social service network, the strength of the social services. The problem social services has today, I'm sorry to say, is not lack of funding from the province. We all want the province to give us more money. The problem is we don't have staff to spend the money on. That is really true of the Child Care Initiative, a wonderful initiative. The federal government's got all kinds of money sitting on the table. We can't find child care workers. So personnel is the real poverty factor for agencies. And it's going to really affect our capacity to do things about these risk factors. That's a real challenge for EKIOC. How in the world are we going to be, our agencies are getting weaker and we're giving them a bigger challenge. So we have challenges in our schools. I want to talk about that. The Education Quality and Accountability Offices provides data on the results of standardized testing for students 3 to 6. And they also have data on the special needs groups requiring an IEP and IPRC. Except for gifted students, students struggle with math. And this is very evident in low achievers, which are all the kids scoring below 2 in the standardized testing. So the standardized testing scores every kid on reading, writing, and math on a 4-point scale. Low achievers are everybody with 1 or 2, scores of 1 or 2. In reading, 1% of all the kids in Ontario score 1 or 2. In writing, they score 1 or 2. And in math, 18% of all kids are 1 or 2. Math is a really big problem in the capacity of our kids. Now, I correlated that with low achievers on the IEP. That's people on the IEP that have intellectual disabilities, autism, and various and sundry reasons why they might be low achievers. So of the 1% that are low achievers, 62 of them percent in an IEP. Of the 1% in writing that are low achievers, 63% in an IEP. And of the math group, only 54% in an IEP. So what that's telling me is that there is a lot of kids that are not even being identified as needing an individualized educational plan who are really low achievers. So this is a systemic problem. It's a really big systemic problem for math, for kids with math, And if you look at the low achievers, there's big numbers in it, 25,800 low achievers in math in the province. This is going to roll into your local communities. Unfortunately, I don't have data locally because it's protected by EKIOC. They don't want anybody to know. They don't want anybody in the province to compare Leeds and Grenville with, I don't know, Fulton, because I guess they're worried you might be offended. But I can't figure out where the problem is located. Okay, I want to look at the next thing, the next slide, which is, by the way, on the math thing, there's another reason for the low numbers in math. One of them is that being competent in math requires a quiet mind. There's a lot of research on that, especially by Deutsch, you know, the psychiatrist at CAMH, who wrote a wonderful book. I just forget the name of it now. The Mind That Repairs Itself. If you ever read that book. But math requires a quiet mind. What our kids are experiencing in school today is anything but a quiet mind. They're emotionally distressed. You cannot be competent in math if you're emotionally distressed. It's funny, but you can be emotionally distressed and do well at reading and writing. Partly because reading is a very emotionally evocative, releasing enterprise. So I just wanted to share that with you. Math requires a quiet mind. It is a symptom of the fact that our kids do not have a quiet mind. And that is a big problem in school. Emotional dysregulation, which is not the same thing as mental illness. I can get into that a little bit. I'll get into that a little bit later. But it is a serious emotional symptom that's going on. The decline in the mature age cohort is uneven. Oh, I got that already. Now, I want to talk about the percentage of lone parents, and I want to introduce a concept of concentrated disadvantage. I made the comment to you that comorbidity is the #1 predictor of bad outcomes. In sociology, there's a ton of literature on this, and I've got it up on the server so you could get it, by a guy named Sampson, coined a term called concentrated disadvantage. Communities where there are concentrated disadvantage, multiple risk factors and high percentages of them are centers of concentrated disadvantages, and the proportion of bad outcomes increases significantly in centers of concentrated disadvantage. In other words, it's like a ball rolling downhill. It really accelerates and amplifies the bad outcomes. There are 6 places in the local comparison group that I identified as having the characteristics of concentrated disadvantage based entirely on numbers. This is a subject I think EKIOC got to look at, and you can certainly disagree with it, but let me give you why I said it. This is the percentage of one parents versus 2-parent households in Cornwall. Look at that, it's almost 50-50. Or in Hawkesbury, 48 to 52. Prescott, 40 to 60. Brockville, 44 to 56. Smiths Falls, I didn't spell it right, 45 to 55. Perth, 46 to 54. There's your baseline in the Ottawa Corona. 29 to 71. And that average includes the high averages. That's the average for the whole Corona, which includes the high numbers. You know, if I compare it to all the low number places, the disparity between the two groups would be even greater. Like if I pull these numbers out of the thing, this number would be even lower or higher in this case. So you can see that there's a real issue here. This is the signature of concentrated disadvantage. Okay, now I want to talk about the risk factors causing adverse outcomes. First of all, this is a very dense table, and I apologize for it. You can look at it a little later, but what you can see is that these are about 8 of 20 risk factors that I've identified in the core database, and I lined them up against the 6 areas of disadvantage, and you can clearly see if you went through it, everywhere. Perth is the one borderline case, by the way. Perth is just a little bit between the two. The top 5, Cornwall, Hawkesbury, Prescott, Brockville, and Smiths Falls, are way above the Ottawa Corona on things like housing stress, hidden unemployment, female hidden unemployment, Indigenous hidden unemployment, the kind of combination of hidden and official unemployment for the whole population, the percentage of people that didn't look at this. In Cornwall, 47% of the population over 15 did not work. 51% in Hawkesbury didn't work. 49% in Brockville didn't work. So you can see a big population that didn't work. Now that's way above the Corona population of 40%. And household income below 40,000. This is poverty. If you're below 40,000, you are below the poverty basket if you're a family, if you're a household. So this is household income before 40,000. 30% of all the households in Cornwall are below 40,000, compared to 19% for the Ottawa Corona. And kids under the age of 6 in lone parent families in poverty, very high percentages among these concentrated disadvantages. And the criminal index, which I'll get into later on, very high, if not double, more than double in some cases for some of these centers. If you just look at that, look at Cornwall, 112 compared to 68 in the Ottawa Corona. Actually, 68 is in the province of Ontario. I'm sorry. I had to I qualified that in the paper itself, but that's actually, I don't have the Ottawa Corona for various technical reasons, but that's the Ontario average. So you can see that these centers are all way above the Ontario average, except for Perth. So anyway, you can see that that's why I call them areas of concentrated disadvantages. I think that's your problem, Kate. I think those are your problem centers. I think they deserve a special discussion at EKIOC. A high fraction of renters are in core need. That's another key indicator of a risk factor. Core housing need applies to people whose shelter arrangements are not suitable, large enough given the size of the family, not affordable. The rent is greater than 30% or more of the total before tax income. And usually it's 50, 60, 70% more. In other words, it's like a big number, not just 30 is the bottom. Like most people are well above that. And core need refers to not adequate, as in not structurally sound. This is all Statistical Canada. This is all Stats Canada's numbers. This is all hard numbers. In addition, there's no apparent, in addition to the criteria for core housing need, no alternative rental units available locally that are suitable, adequate, and affordable. In other words, renters who meet the criteria of core housing need are under significant stress and are at risk of being homeless. If they have children, this is a significant risk factor driving the need for admission to CAS care. 31% of all households in Ontario are renters and 28% in Ottawa Corona. That's just renters, okay? That's just renters. Some of them are okay. I gave you that because that's your baseline. In other words, this core housing need related to renters is going to be applicable to about a third of society. So this is a big number of potential problem cases, okay? Now I want to talk about the housing distress. Across Ontario, 428,000 renters are in core need, representing 25% of all renters in Ontario. So 31% of all households in Ontario are renters. A quarter of them are in core housing need. This is a huge proportion of renters that are in trouble, that are borderline homeless. And borderline homeless means that you have two lone parents living in the same apartment because they have to share space because the other one would be homeless if it wasn't for the other one that brought them in. So I'm talking about overcrowding in some of your apartments and things like that. So this is core housing need. By the way, Statistics Canada does not count the absolute homeless, the guys in the street, the guys, in the tent, okay? Not a huge number though, so don't worry about it. The homeless population finds a way to put a roof over their head, but it's totally unstable. It includes everybody, by the way, that are in shelters. Statistics Canada counts the people in shelters. So that number is included there. Within the Ottawa Corona, there are 12,616 households in core need, or 19% of all rental households. This is a really big number in the Ottawa Corona. This means, in terms of child welfare, a lot of potential customers. In the 6 high-need areas of concentrated disadvantage, just to give you a background, 45% of the households are renters. In other words, the areas of concentrated disadvantage have a much higher proportion of renters, 21,000 renters to be exact. 4,487 of these renters are in core need. So there's thousands of households in those 6 centers that are in core need, as in borderline homeless. 20% of all the houses, of all the households in the Ottawa Corona live in these 6 small, high-need cities. So these 6 centers, by the way, represent 1/5 of all the households in the entire local community. 1/5. So this is a big chunk of humanity that you're looking at in these high-need areas. 32% of all the renters in the Ottawa Corona live in these high-need areas. So like 1/3 of everybody who's renting lives in those 5 or 6 cities. And 36% of the renters in these areas are in core need. So in other words, the core need in these high-risk groups, in these high-risk cities, like, is really, really high. It's more than 1/3. So this is a really big chunk of the population in the high-risk areas that are in intense housing distress, according to Statistics Canada. So I wanted to point that out to you because that's a big indicator and it's a big volume. I want to say, like, when the volume is very high, it's much more important for you to be aware of it. In other words, if I get a high, in other words, if there's only 100 people that are in the basket, then don't worry about it too much. It's manageable. Well, when you got thousands, you got a problem. Okay, so be careful about percentiles. That's the lesson. You're going to see lots of percentiles in the data tables. Be careful about the percentiles. With housing needs and other indicators of vulnerable population, high percentages can be misleading. For example, the 5 places with the highest percentage of the people in core need actually represent only 11% of the people in the Corona. They're only 11% of the total population. And they are not on your high needs group. For example, in Clarence Rockland, 585 renters. Well, that's the number, that's the percentage of renters, okay? And that's the in core need. So 32% of all the renters are in core need. There's 545 renters in total, okay? Hang on, I've got to put that. No, that's not. I'm sorry, I might be wrong about that. Just hang on a minute. Yeah, sorry. No, what I meant is there's 585 renters in Clarence Rockland that are in core need. That represents 32%, 1/3 of all the renters. In Westport, 44 are in high need, representing 40% of all the renters. And in North Grenville, 243 households are in core need, representing 28%. In Smith Falls, 458 or 1/4 are in high need. In Frontenac Islands, 25 people or 39%. So, but you see, look at that, add up all these columns and that's 1,355 households, which represents 11% of all the households in core need in the Corona. So higher percentages, but smaller numbers makes it a little less of a worry or a little less needy. Then if I flipped it around and I said, let's just look at the areas of concentrated disadvantage, you see slightly smaller percentages, but much bigger numbers of renters in high need. So Cornwall only has 22% in high need of all the renters, but it's 2,131 households. That's more than the entire size of the prior group, if you see what I'm saying. So you have to look at both the raw number and the percentages. I guess that's what I'm saying. And on the raw number, the concentrated disadvantages are really presenting as a bigger problem, I guess. Although if you look at it, I guess Brockville and Cornwall are really the big ones. Anyway, that's what it really says. Anyway, I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit losing my brain a little bit on it, losing my point. I'm just saying you have to have a balanced view when you're looking at the data tables. Look at both the raw numbers and you need to look at both the percentages. The percentages need to be high to start to get worried, but highest is not necessarily significant if they're associated with very low gross numbers. Okay, so let's look at the next thing called the market basket measure. This is really important. And this is a big change. As of 2019, Statistics Canada is now reverting to the market basket measure to report poverty. Prior to that date, the word poverty in Statistics Canada was never used. It was rather low income thresholds. Low income thresholds means exactly that. Statistics Canada, when it was calculating kids in poverty, they were saying those are all the kids who live in the families who are in the bottom half of the median income. The median income is the point where 50%, which divides the population into 50-50. So low income was always kids who were in the bottom half of the income basket. And then they would say not just the bottom half, but maybe the bottom 30%. So they would just arbitrarily push. It's just like looking at a graph distribution and taking the bottom third of it and calling it people in poverty, but it's a low income measure. And many, especially columnists at the Globe and Mail, really crucified Statistics Canada for it and said, well, that doesn't mean they're living in poverty. That could mean they're South Korean immigrants who are running a grocery store, and they're all 11 of them are working in the grocery store, and technically they're low income, but they got aspirations, and 5 of those kids are going to be doctors before long. They're anything but suffering, would be the argument the Globe and Mail would say. And so therefore they really disparaged the percentage of kids in poverty. You know, all the conservative talking heads, the Fraser Institute, really went nuts over this. So Statistics Canada has completely reversed it. They've now got a number called the market basket measure, and that is based on absolute data on the amount of money to meet the cost of basic needs in each location. That means the amount of money you need to pay for clothing, housing, food, transportation, and medical needs. That's the absolute minimum amount of money you need to pay for that. If you can't meet that threshold, then you have to start taking out food, clothing, transportation. You have to rely on food banks. So this is now a substantial measure of poverty. Anything below the market basket measure of the kids that I'm going to report on now that are below this threshold, they are suffering in a material way. It's no longer just low income. These are kids that don't have enough money for food, period, full stop. Nearly 30% of these kids are suffering significantly with bodily deprivations that will harm the children physically and for the rest of their lives. And that is across the province, 28%, ages 0 to 5, are in lone parent households below that market basket threshold. That translates into almost 30% of all the kids in lone parent households in Ontario who are little kids are suffering bodily. This is a big number. This is a big problem. Across Ontario, children under 6 living in poverty in lone parent homes were 28% below that threshold. So we're talking significant deprivation in this group. And the last point I want to make is the geographic distribution of infant poverty is grossly inequitable. So this is where geography makes a big difference. Just look at this. 10 local jurisdictions, or of 43, there's 43 local jurisdictions. That means towns and cities and villages, okay, in your neighborhood. 10 have 0 children under 6 living in a lone parent home. I mean, I got the table, you can see them. 18 jurisdictions, which is 43% of the total, have 955 young children in lone parent homes. 0 are living in poverty. Just think that in mind. So, okay, you got 995 children in these 18 jurisdictions. None of them are in poverty. You're okay still. There are 18 CSDs with no children in poverty. The 18 CSDs with no children in poverty have 29% of the children in lone parent homes. In other words, in these jurisdictions contain 29% of all your lone parents, and they're okay. That's good news for you guys. The entire burden of poverty among children under 6 in lone parent homes is carried by 15 jurisdictions, or only 35% of your neighborhoods. And there are 920 children living in poverty out of 3,240 children under 6 in LP homes in 15 local jurisdictions. So really what I'm saying to you is that this indicator, this risk factor, is not equitably distributed. It is highly concentrated in 15 specific areas. And so obviously that's an important issue for you. That just illustrates, that is tremendous leverage when it comes to risk factors. So I think that's a subject for you guys to talk about, and I would certainly target that group because their brains are their brains are dying before your eyes. The brains of 920 children right now are dying before your eyes. The geography, so there's the geography of poverty. So I got that. Crime and violence. Crime and violence are significant risk factors for adverse outcomes affecting the children of families involved. Families get enmeshed in crime as victims and as the home where the offender lives. So in other words, the whole family gets enmeshed in crime. It isn't just the criminal perpetrator that causes harm. He causes harm to his whole family. So that means crime touches a large segment of society, especially in high crime areas. Not to say all of the people who were traumatized by crime. So crime is a driver of lots of bad outcomes. And if you look at the crime rates, this is a very dense table, but what it basically tells you is that Smith Falls has the highest crime rates and the worst crimes. The criminal severity index and the violent severity index is a calculation by Statistics Canada about how serious the violence was and how serious the criminal misconduct was. And on both those counts, Smiths Falls is the #1 in your local neighborhood. It has double that rate in the criminal severity index, it's double the provincial average. And it's a little higher than the provincial average. It's 223 in Smith Falls, much higher than the local community, and a little bit higher than the provincial average. So the violent severity index is being carried in a lot of ways by some of the bigger cities and some of the other jurisdictions. That's semi-good news for you a little bit, I guess. It's not as bad as it could be. The percentage of heavy drinking. Heavy drinking is a powerful risk factor and a driver of CS admissions to care. Heavy drinking causes premature death, disease, mental illness, family conflict, marital breakdown, traffic fatalities, intrauterine brain damage, suicide, and violence. Heavy drinking is like the mother, along with crime and poverty, the mother of almost all your bad outcomes. The data is available at the public health unit level. The data is from 2015 to 2020. In the current multi-year period, 17.1% of the population of Ontario is engaged in heavy drinking. That means a minimum of 5 drinks in one session per month. That's a big number of heavy drinkers. No wonder we have highway traffic accidents. Look at this. In Leeds and Grenville and Lanark, the rate of heavy drinking that is, has a rate of heavy drinking that is close to the provincial average. It's about 18%. But in contrast, Eastern Ontario Health Unit, which is Leeds and Grenville, Prescott, Russell, and SDG, have 22.2%, and Lennox has 21.6%. These are significantly higher than the provincial average. So by and large, this is I think, a significant problem locally, and it's worse in some places. The risk factor, we've also got data on the parent or the partner who are clients of the Healthy Babies caseload. And the parent, 18% of the clients of the Healthy Baby caseloads have a parent who has a mental illness. And in Eastern Ontario and Leeds and Lanark, 30 and 33% respectively have mental illness. And so there is a significant degree of variability in this risk factor, as reflected in the table below. So what does this mean? First of all, mental illness is a big risk factor, especially for child welfare. and a big customer for community mental health. And when there are families involved, as in the case of the Healthy Babies caseload, this is a very serious concern, very serious, because this is and by the way, this includes things like depression. And, this is where you get neglect. Neglect is not a willful act. It's the act of people, serious neglect is the act of people who are seriously depressed and can't get the job done because of their illness. And so when you start looking at a caseload, at a percentiles like this, you're looking at a pretty big number. We don't know what the absolute number is of parents, okay? So to the degree that the Healthy Babies caseload is representative of parents, this is a very significant percentile. Mainly urban centers with moderate population density, which includes Cornwall, Brockville, is 20.5%. Sparsely populated urban-rural mix, which is most of your community, 32%. And mainly rural, 25%. And large population centers with high population density, 7.9%. What this tells you and me is that, and this is probably good numbers as being really representative of the underlying data in the community, the basic problem. What it tells me is that Ottawa, Toronto, Halton, Middlesex, they don't have a big problem here. They have the lowest problem of mental illness. The places where mental illness is a big problem, especially, is in the kind of neighborhoods you have, the urban-rural mix. Like lots of rural townships, a bit of towns in between. It's a third of that population. And mainly rural is very high as well. So the mainly urban centers would be really like big places like Cornwall and Brockville might fit that criteria. But it's really big, sizable places, like Waterloo and those bigger towns, Peterborough, that kind of stuff. That's what's in mainly urban centers with moderate population density. So what this tells me is that the 25 and 32% is in your neighborhood for the most part. And I think it's a pretty serious concern. The reason, by the way, the overall data shows you that the reason for that is because it's harder for people who are in deep trouble to be noticed when they're in a low population density place. And by that, I mean women who are being physically battered. They get injured much more severely. The data shows that they're injured much more severely in these low population centers, these low density places are typical of your neighborhood. They're much more likely to suffer longer and to be injured more severely than, let's say, the women in Ottawa, just to give you an example. And in a similar way, parents that are suffering from severe mental illness are not picked up by their neighbors nearly as quickly as they are in the large population centers. Plus, it's harder for them to access resources. If you're a woman who's being battered, it's harder for you to access resources in these small towns because you've got to get in a car, you got to get moving. You can't walk across the street to a local family violence shelter. In some of these small communities, they aren't across the street. They're usually a half-hour drive away, or they're in places like Ottawa. And if you've got a serious mental health problem, it's harder to find someone that can help you with it. Or you've got an addictions problem, like you're on fentanyl or crystal meth, which is very prevalent in the smaller centers. It's much harder to reach an intervener. So I just want to let you know about that basic rule of thumb. Mental illness, drug addiction, family violence are much higher in the urban-rural mix of these low-density population centers. When I'm talking about mainly rural, I'm talking about really rural centers, like especially up north, or like, in places like Huron County and Bruce, when you've really got a lot of farmland. Your places you have less farmland, at least in Grenville, you'll see that in the data sheet, and a lot more people living, in the countryside, low density. But the data shows a much higher percentage of people who are people in trouble. Medium shelter costs for homeowners. I've got some data on that. It's been, just to let you know, it's been fairly, do I have that? Oh, this is indicators of resilience. I want to give you some of that. The median shelter costs for homeowners, we talk about the headline news. Homeowners, deep trouble. The Globe and Mail's on that case, 16 ways to heaven and back. I looked at all the bloody data, and in fact, the vast majority of homeowners are in really good shape. The vast majority of people in Ontario are homeowners, and they're in pretty good shape. Home ownership is a sign of resilience, not a problem. It is a problem for young people trying to get into the market. But the vast majority of homeowners, it's a form of resilience. In the census subdivisions with concentrated disadvantages, which is that group there, I figured out the inflation in home. This is median shelter costs, their entire shelter costs. That has risen in 10 years overall by 4%. All across Ontario, which is less than 0.5% over the inflation rate during that period. Okay, not bad. In the high need area, it had decreased by 9% over the 9 years. So in 21, the average median shelter cost is $918 for homeowners in your high density area, which proves that resilience works when it coexists with risk. It doesn't prove it, but I'm just saying that resilience, you need resilience when you got risk. Resilience in a happy valley neighborhood is like nice to have, but who cares? I mean, you're having a good life. What the hell? You need resilience in high-risk neighborhoods. That's where you need to find resilience. You've got it in homeowners. And the income of lone parents is also a sign of resilience. The average income of lone parents has increased significantly everywhere in the province, including the historically disadvantaged census subdivisions. And this means that many children and families have been lifted out of poverty. The average income of lone parents varies significantly by the age of the lone parent, just to go to show you. Younger lone parents who are homeowners in Brockville, just to give you an example, have an average income of $55,000 compared to $75,000 for older lone parents. So just to let you know, age makes a difference when you're trying to look for poverty among the lone parents. So now I turned it around from a resilience point of view, and I looked at households over 200,000. This is a really good news story. Household income over 200,000 is about 5 times more than the poverty rate using the BMB threshold criteria. 12% of all households in Ontario have incomes over this amount. This is a huge chunk of Ontario that is doing very, very well. Ottawa is 15% over that amount. Russell Township has 16%. Halton Region has 23%. These represent a larger segment of society above this threshold, and it really shows increasing prosperity for Ontario. In my main report, what you're going to find out is I just want you to know that everything that I'm saying about Ontario is true. It's more than true in BC, Alberta, and Montreal. Ontario is not the absolute richest. The disparity of income, the super rich are out west. And the super rich is in, even richer than this, higher percentages are in Alberta and in BC and in Montreal, just to let you know. So Ontario is that kind of the sweet spot. In a way, less income disparity, and still a lot of people very, very wealthy. In the Ottawa Corona, it's only 8% compared to 15% in Ottawa itself. And the rural subdivisions all have about 8% above this threshold. In the 6 high-risk areas, only 3% are above this, but that still means that they've got people above this. This actually is good news for the residents of Cornwall. The wealthy neighbors enrich the community resources, which are accessible to all. The fact that poorer people outnumber the wealthy by tenfold insulates them from some of the toxic effects of poverty, which is stigma, social isolation, and self-loathing. In other words, if you got a lot of people who are poor, it's not my fault. I got a whole bunch of neighbors there in this basket. And, so there is a certain, in a bizarre kind of way, a lot of poverty does have a bit of a silver lining to it, which is it tends to help with these secondary problems associated with poverty. Okay, then the other issue of resilience is perceived mental health. This is derived from a survey of the mental health that the Statistics Canada covered. Self-described mental health in Ontario for all groups is about 80% of public health units. So that correlates nicely with the 20% that are mentally ill. This is showing 20% self-described mental health problems, 80% self-described okay. So this is your 80-20 ratio. In the city of Ottawa, it's significantly lower, which is around 60%. So there's a higher degree of mental health problems in the city of Ottawa. In Eastern Ontario, it's a bit better than, so in other words, the provincial average is a bit higher. So hang on a bit. I'm just screwed up with the numbers a little bit there. So you have to look at you have to look at the raw data tables to show it a bit more. But the key message is basically is that Leeds and Grenville and Lanark seem to have a bit better mental well-being, maybe lesser poor well-being. And this is self-described. This is not based on epidemiology. I studied the consensus of mental health effects of COVID. The data which is published in the British Medical Journal, which is on your server, has indicated that there has been an increase with depression and anxiety among vulnerable groups like LGBTQ and Indigenous and Black, and in a minority of municipalities, but no adverse effects for most neighborhoods and most people. In other words, mental illness collectively is not going up, except among vulnerable groups that are subject to discrimination. So that's the consensus of the British Medical Journal. That's this comment here. But what they also observed was that non-psychiatric symptoms have increased. In other words, worries, misery, and misbehavior are all significantly worse post-COVID. So what the data is showing is that mental illness per se is not really going up, with a few exceptions in targeted groups. In fact, what's going up is what they call pre-morbid symptoms. Pre-morbid symptoms are anxiety, misery, worry, misbehavior, emotional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation. This is not the same as mental illness. This is pre-morbid. And what that translates into is that when teachers in school are teaching kindergarten and grade 1, they have classrooms that are full of problems. They can't teach the curricula because the kids are out of control. Now, you'll have to ask your teachers whether it's true for your neighborhoods, but it's certainly true in many jurisdictions across Ontario. This is not a mental illness problem. This is a problem of social learning and a social problem. These kids haven't been in school for 2 or 3 years. I got this right here. The narrative information suggests that public school teachers in many classrooms are seeing kids with poor affect regulation and poor behavior regulation and aversive interaction with peers and teachers. They're disrespectful, uncooperative, and bullying. And the possible explanation is that kids need constant reinforcement, opportunities to learn positive behaviors, and a culture that sets high expectations, or they will deteriorate, or at the very least, they won't progress. Secondly, we cannot afford to give young children in early grades time off. Developmental progress is time sensitive. And this is causing problems in our schools. So I don't know. COVID put our kids on hold and we are paying for it. That's what the data is showing. So I did look at the adverse outcomes in Leeds and Lanark and compared it to the Ontario average. And this is very significant. There is significant evidence that there is some significant outcome problems in Leeds and Grenville and Lanark. Let me give you the data. Preventable death, the rate per 100,000 people, is 222.1 in Leeds and Grenville and Lanark, compared to 192 for the Ontario average. The suicide rate in your neighborhood is 13.3 compared to 19.0. This is all 2020. Intentional injuries, ER visits, Ages 0 to 19. This is an indicator of youth mental illness. Intentional industries includes things like slashing. 417.5, that's a 0.5%. That's just a 0.5%. It's almost twice the Ontario average. Injuries due to assault. This is ER visits for young people, 159 to 118, always higher. Hospitalization for brain injuries, 26 to 21. Mental health conditions entirely caused by alcohol, this is all ages, 540 to 469. So this is 0.5%. Now, this is not just heavy drinking. This is such drinking that you need to be hospitalized. So this is like really hard-edged at the extreme end of it. The rate of adults charged with the crime, and adults charged with the crime in Smith Falls is 42.14, and the Ontario average is 12.45. So in Smith Falls, now it's not a group thing. I can't correlate it with Leeds and Grenville. I can just say in one center, it's 4 times the Ontario average. All of these things are mutually exclusive. So you can sum all the incident data, and it's like 5,500 compared to 2023 for the province, like it's double the provincial average. If I sum the health indicators only, it's 1,300 to 1,000 or 30% higher. So 30% higher or twice. Take your pick, it's bad news. So the first obvious finding is that Leeds and Grenville exceed the provincial average on all adverse outcomes. And so it's bad. And so I'm worried about it. You should know that. There is something happening in your neighborhood that is producing bad outcomes. And it's maybe tied to those areas of significant disadvantage. Certainly the crime rate is. I don't know about the health indicators because they don't have data at the local level. The last thing I want to bring us information on is the Indigenous profile, and then I'll have maybe 15 or 20 minutes to talk, or I can stay as long as you want, but I'll get you out of here at 11:30 with 15 minutes of talk time if you like. This is the Aboriginal People Survey. Statistics Canada did it in 2016, and as a result of this survey, we can now ask these questions. Is the profile of off-reserve Indigenous the same as the on-reserve Indigenous? Is the profile of off-reserve Indigenous different than the non-Indigenous population in the same geographic area? This is comparing Indigenous to mainstream Canadians. Do the off-reserve Indigenous people in the cities and towns acquire the geographic differences apparent in the general census? Like i.e. the variations in the fraction of lone parents. I pointed out that generally speaking, there's a lot of variability in where these indicators exist locally. I want to know if the off-reserve Indigenous track the same differences, or are they running a different story? And are there geographic areas of concentrated disadvantage that are apparent for Indigenous profiles only? And are they the same geographic areas in the general census? In other words, we all know that Brockville, Cornwall are high-need areas for the general population. Are they also high-need areas for Indigenous? So we're going to get an answer to that. Indigenous people grew by 24% between 2011 and 2016, and 8.6% between 2016 and 2021. So it's interesting that period between 2011 and 2016 caused the greatest growth. In general, the total population grew by only 6.3 and 5.8 respectively. So what this is telling you is the Indigenous population is growing faster than the general one. Indigenous women have a higher fertility rate, 2.2 per 1,000 women age 15 to 49 compared to 1.6 for non-Indigenous. The estimated number of babies born between 2011 and 2016 accounts for 1/3 of the growth of people with Indigenous identity during that period. So that, in other words, it's the fertility rate that's driving 1/3 of it. The other might be that they're just identifying more with it's the reconciliation. People are coming out of hiding. They're saying, I'm Indigenous, before they kept it a secret because they were being discriminated against. Indigenous children ages 0 to 14 represents 24% of the Indigenous population. In contrast, non-Indigenous represents 16%. That's okay. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing a higher percentage of Indigenous in care, Aaron. There are more Indigenous children. An intact family with 2 parents, 45% of Indigenous, 68% of non-Indigenous. So you see intact families, that means they're not separated. There's the same group that gave birth to the kids are looking after them today. 45% of Indigenous, but 68% of non-Indigenous. A step family with 2 parents looking after the kids, 11% Indigenous, 6% non-Indigenous. A lone parent family, 37% Indigenous, 23% non-Indigenous. Grandparents without parents present. See, we often think about the grandparents as the big story because it makes nice news, but it's actually a very small percentage. Just keep that in mind, but it's still more Indigenous. These patterns vary significantly at the local level. And furthermore, the differences are not consistent with areas of concentrated disadvantage, suggesting that differences in the way Indigenous people raise their children is not a marker of adverse outcomes. These differences are not causing you problems, Aaron, or from a child welfare point of view. And they're not even correlated with it. It's just Indigenous families have a different pattern. And it's basically okay. It may mean they may need more support. In terms of the foster care issue, which is going to tie right into your comments at the beginning, Aaron, 1.6% of Indigenous children are living in foster care in Ontario, compared to 0.2% of non-Indigenous children who are living in foster care. And this means that Indigenous children are 9 times more likely to be in foster care than non-Indigenous children. 9 times more likely across Ontario. The same data from a different perspective shows that 25% of the children in foster care are Indigenous. This reinforces the priority of the province to uphold rigorous standards of culturally competent care in the residential care sector. So we can see that this problem that you have locally is system-wide. Another finding related to Indigenous people, 2 aspects of housing stress, major repairs and unaffordability are 2 times more prevalent among Indigenous households. Indigenous households in the 6 jurisdictions of high need share the same stressors, but only to a greater degree. Both groups identify the same communities at high risk on housing stress. So Indigenous people have even more housing stress than non-Indigenous than in the high need areas. 41% of Indigenous households in the high risk communities spend too much on shelter. So that means locally, 41% of all the Indigenous households are really in trouble on this variable. So that's important. That's an answer to one of your questions. Across Ontario and locally, Indigenous people have between 1.5 and 2 times as much hidden unemployment as non-Indigenous population. However, the geography of the high-risk Indigenous population is not aligned with the non-Indigenous group on this factor. So this is interesting. If you look at the communities of highest risk for non-Indigenous people locally, and now hidden unemployment means these people are not in the labor force at all. They've given up on ever getting a job. And this is a group that sociologists have identified as really a mother of all kinds of bad outcomes. 58%, 52% of everybody 15 to 64 in Akwesasne are unemployed and have been unemployed for years. In Cornwall, it's 38% of the Indigenous. In Hawkesbury, it's 53%. In Prescott, it's 42%. And in Smiths Falls, it's 35%. Compared to the non-Indigenous, look at that. The non-Indigenous are like almost half. So isn't that interesting? It tracks nicely with the high-risk neighborhoods, but it's twice as high. So now let's look at the communities of highest risk for Indigenous people. I just flipped it. I just says, okay, well, we can see that it tracks nicely with our high needs groups, with the community level, community-wide high needs groups. But look at this, all kinds of communities locally that are not high needs have a huge hidden unemployment problem for the Indigenous people. So Westport, 100% of the Indigenous are unemployed and have not in the workforce at all. And in places like Frontenac Islands, 57%. Hawkesbury is 50, we already got that. South Dundas, 52%. Alfred and Plantagenets, 40%. Augusta, 43%. So you see that there is a lot of hidden unemployment, you know, in areas that you would not necessarily think about as high needs locally. So let's get a summary of the Indigenous group here, and then I'm free to talk to you. Is the profile of off-reserve Indigenous like the on-reserve Indigenous? No. The 117 reserves in Ontario are poor, because I have that on my computer. Median income for the POP over 15 in private households is 18,000. Off-reserve income in 473 census subdivisions is 24,000. So the off-reserve natives are wealthier individually. No Indigenous on reserve? No, it's not the same. Indigenous on reserve have fewer job opportunities. The official unemployment rate on reserves is 20%. The off-reserve official unemployment rate is 9.6%. So you can see in that number alone, you know, like the off-reserve are doing better than the on-reserve Indigenous. I do have all of the reserves on my computer of Ontario. If it would be helpful to you, I can upload that data to the server to you. That's not a problem for me. I didn't give it all to you because I didn't know if you wanted to have that many rows on your spreadsheets. Is the profile of the off-reserve Indigenous people different than the non-Indigenous population in the same geographic area? The answer is yes, to a profound degree. So the Indigenous are different than the non-Indigenous. Indigenous are different than the mainstream. The Indigenous population has a higher percentage of children aged 0 to 4, 24% compared to 16%. A larger proportion of Indigenous children applies to 85% of the subdivisions. In other words, this rule, higher proportion of children, is system-wide. 85% of all the census is true for 85% of all the divisions. Indigenous population has a higher percentage of young adults in the 15 to 24-year-old age range. The non-Indigenous population has a larger share of adults in the 25 plus. The non-Indigenous population is 2 times the share of adults 65 years of age and older. So that's a big difference. Indigenous population has a larger share of couples who live in common law rather than married. So this is the way the Indigenous families make families. They don't get married as often as the mainstream do. A lower percentage of Indigenous children are growing up in an intact family. A higher percentage of Indigenous children are living with step families. A higher percentage of Indigenous children are living in alone parent households. Indigenous children are 9 times more likely to be in foster care. A higher percentage of Indigenous children do not attain educational standing. Of Indigenous people do not attain educational standing beyond high school. So 55% of Indigenous do not get beyond high school compared to 45% generally. Everybody who doesn't get beyond high school are at much higher risk of being hidden unemployed, just by the way. Question number 3 is, are risk fractions correlated? All these various percentages correlated. Do the off-reserve Indigenous people in the cities and towns acquire the geographic differences apparent in the general census? In other words, the variations in the fraction of lone parents, is it the same? Is it correlated? Well, the answer is yes. They are correlated by location. High need areas have a higher percentage of risk factors, stressors, low income for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So that's important for you to know. Risk factors, the same, the location where you find the risk factors is going to be the same for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, even though in general, the non-Indigenous people are different. The Indigenous people have a different profile. But what I'm saying is that they're different normally. But when you zero the question into their abnormal things, the risk factors, they're quite the same. They're quite correlated. They're just worse than the white folk. That's the answer. Are there geographic areas of concentrated disadvantage that are apparent? Well, yes, the 6 locations that I think are high need areas are also high need for the Indigenous, but there were more locations of constituted disadvantage among the Indigenous. And however, there were significantly fewer variables counted in the Indigenous survey. And so we need a note of caution in this finding. The Indigenous population is less than 3% of the mainstream population. So this means the margins of error are greater for the Indigenous people. And that means be a little cautious with my findings on the Indigenous, because when you're dealing with a very small population and Statistics Canada is doing a random survey, that means their margins of error are double. And so just keep that in mind. You just need to be a little bit cautious. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry I went longer than I thought I would, but I knew that I would. Stop sharing for a second. Now, what I would like to do, now normally, if I was a human being, first of all, I'm a man, so I'm still learning how to become human. Being a man, I never invite my audience of my seminars, do they want to go to the bathroom? Or do you need a break, or you need to get some coffee? I suppose I ought to. That'd be more civilized of me if I did that. If anybody needs to take a break, okay. But otherwise, if you would like to ask some questions, that's also okay. And the third possibility is if you want to look at the raw data tables just to get a feeling for them, that's also okay.
So for those of you that are attending online, which is the vast majority of you, feel free to turn your cameras back on if you would like, and to unmute yourself if you have a question or a request about seeing some of the data tables. Go ahead, Marina.
Thank you for your presentation, Bob. It's just chock full of information, a lot to sift through. I'm not to put you on the spot if it's not immediately available. I'm happy to look through the data later, but just wondering if you can comment on who else makes up our population from a diversity perspective. So you
sure.
Indigenous.
Yes, that's right. For sure. I have a lot of that sort of stuff. And let me see if I can, let me just get that. I want to get that directly, if you don't mind. I got to get, this is where all the data is. You can see all the data tables. That's how it sort of looks on the server. And I'm going to get that thing, which is the ethnicity table. I'm going to open up that. Now, I just got to, are you seeing this? The ethnicity table?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. So here are your visible minorities. So here's your raw data tables. And you can see what I call the local areas right down here. And you can see all the rows that I've got. Can everybody see the data tables now?
Yeah, we can see the list of data tables. That's all we should be seeing. Right
now. Okay. So hang on a minute. I'm going to fix that up. I'm going to share. I have to change the sharing. Sorry about that. Let me just get there. Oh, darn it. Where are you? Data sharing. I'm trying to find my data sharing table. Oh, there it is. Let's see if I can get there. Oh, there it is. Stop sharing. And now I got to share a different screen. Sorry about that. I apologize. Where the hell am I? Needs blue board. Where is my thing? I'll show all the windows. Sorry, I'm trying to find the window with my ethnicity. Oh, there it is. Okay, share. All right, so now you can see the ethnicity table. In answer to your question, this is a table. This is called Ethnicity Table 9. It answers that question that I think you asked. I forget which one that was who asked me that. But there is your, for example, visible minorities. What you can see here, for example, is that Ontario-wide has almost a third of the people are visible minorities. But if you look at the Ottawa Corona, 6% are visible minorities, but 32%, the same as the province of Ottawa, is a visible minority. And so that's the first thing. You're seeing less than 10% of your communities locally outside of Ottawa are in the visible minority population. And if you go across, you can see how many of them are by the different visible minorities, like Black and so forth, how many people there are. So even though, you know, I'm saying that it's a small percentage, it still is thousands of people. So I don't want to minimize that. But I just want to let you know, if I go to the ethnicity table, if you see that, okay, I've now opened up ethnicity tab 9B. And do you see on the screen the Anglo composite? Okay, if you do, you can see that if I just looked at ethnicity, what I did is I created a composite, which is in yellow. Statistics Canada asked the question, what's your ethnicity? And they published 250 different ethnic answers. They sort of, it's an open-ended question, so they just did a qualitative analysis and came up with 50 different answers that people across Canada gave to the ethnicity question. And then they just published it. And it's like a whole basket of different ethnicities. But I could clearly see several different answers for Anglo, including English, Irish, Scottish, British Isles, for example, and several different answers for French, like including French, NOS, Franco-Ontarian, French Canadian. And so I put that, I added those together as a Franco composite and the Anglo composite. And I've also got a whole, like, just many different answers for Indigenous, and I put that in the form of an Indigenous composite, okay? So I tried to assemble all these different ethnicities into some kind of a group that's able to be analyzed. And what you can see is that across Ontario, 48% of the population is Anglo. That's interesting. That's less than 50%, considering our history. And in the Ottawa Corona, it's 74%. So the Ottawa Corona is far more Anglo than, let's say, Ontario is as a whole. And in the Ottawa Corona, it's 22% Franco, which is a bit more, quite a bit more than the Franco component for the province of Ontario. And then if I'm rolling across, you can see among the Indigenous composite is 4% for Ottawa. For Ontario, it's 4%, 3.9%, and the Indigenous population is 7% in the Ottawa Corona. So you can see how, and if you look at your populations, you can see a lot of variation in things like the Indigenous identity, okay? And then if you keep going across, you look at the Great Diversity. Now, the Great Diversity is everybody else. If you look at Ontario, this is Canada-wide there, I think. Just hang on a minute. Yikes. There's a problem right here on my darn table. I offset it. I will fix up errata like that. Don't worry, I will do that. If you're seeing me do this, I apologize. I thought I got all these little errors. But what happened is that, you know, my data table was just shifted up 2 rows. So across Ontario, 39% of the population are anything but English, French, or Indigenous. So isn't that interesting? If I looked at down the row, if you look at Stormont, Dundas, it's only 2%. Prescott Russell, 15% are anything but those 3. In Ottawa, it's 23% are anything but English, French, or Indigenous. If you look at the Ottawa Corona, it's 0%. So in answer to your question, 0% Indigenous diversity compared to the mainstream answers of English, French, and Indigenous. Now, I want to put a qualifier. Statistics Canada allows you to give 10 answers if that's what you want. So what I did is I figured out who gave the answers of English, French, and Indigenous. And I said, now that 0% means it covers, those answers cover 100% of your people in the Ottawa Corona. But that doesn't mean people in the Ottawa Corona don't have secondary and third other answers. In other words, it's just saying that they don't primarily identify with the diversity. They primarily identify with English, French, and Indigenous, and then they've got some other things they identify with. If you hear what I'm saying. Now, I'll give you the absolute answer in a second. I'll show you that, but that's just interesting. There's far more diversity in the big
Another
cities.
question for you. I think Lorena has a second question for you.
Okay,
So my primary concern is Lanark, Leeds, Grenville. So what I'm seeing is a number of zeros. So just a question about that. And then when you call the great diversity, can we drill into that a little bit further?
Yes.
And I'm not
Sure.
saying to do that today.
Yeah.
We can do that. I just want to know
Okay.
if that's.
okay, I can. I'm going to show you. On my tabs, look at tab 9E, click it. This is the absolute ethnic diversity of Leeds and Grenville. And I've got a separate one for Lanark. There you are. That's the total table. Irish, 30, this is the population, 103. 31% identify as Irish, 29% Scottish, English, French, German, Italian, 3%, Polish. So here it is. There's your whole data table. That's the absolute answer to your question. Now, this is not sorted by Bob. So in other words, you can look at the truth, just understand that this adds up to quite a bit more than 100%. I'll give you the addition. Because of the multiple answers, 179%. So even though you've got whatever the number, there's 183,000 answers to that question in Leeds only. Okay, so this is the problem that you have. You've got multiple answers to this, but you can see just straight up answers to that question. Sorry about that. I tried to answer it in two different ways. This is one, group it. What you might call the primary answers? How much room is there for diversity? And then flip it around, regardless of that calculation, what in fact is the distribution of answers. So in Leeds and Grenville, what you're looking at is an awful lot of 1% of the whole thing are in this various and sundry group. 585 identify as Indian from India. 540 identify as Danish. And it's spread all over the place within Leeds and Grenville. So that's how I answered that question. Is that okay? Does that give you the answer you're looking for?
Certainly does. We can look a little bit more closely at that within our organization, but thank you.
And I also gave you the answers to the question, to the English and French too. Most people in your neighborhood are either speak English or French, but there is a number that speak unofficial languages, which is all that diversity, and that's on the table as well under the languages. And I've given you Leeds language tab too, which gives you the great diversity of language. This shows you the absolute number of people who speak languages such as Tamil. You have 75 in your neighborhood that speak Tamil, for example. So I took the answer, I took that question both as language and as ethnic identity. So I'm going to stop sharing that table now. That's table 9. I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm back together with you. The table that I showed you illustrates the raw data, because I present the raw data sometimes by just looking at the whole county and just looking at the tremendous amount of detail of the column underneath it. And this Leeds and Grenville, and the rows are all the variables. Most of the time I'm looking at the rows being the place and the variables being on the column. And that works well, but if I'm dealing with 100 variables, I can only do it the other way. You know what I mean? So and then I have to group it somehow. Okay, so that just gives you the feeling for that. You'll notice that I know that I think Aaron talked about the LGBTQ2S population, and I have several tables which are summary tables on the needs of that population. They are a high need group by virtue of the fact that they are highly discriminated against, and discrimination is like the risk factor. It causes enormous problems for anybody who's the object of that discrimination. And so certainly the LGBT carry a lot of risk from the discrimination against them. And that's getting worse as society starts to blame them for all of these problems. Like it looks like America's getting angrier and angrier, and it feels to me like Canada's getting angrier and angrier about the COVID and the money and this and the that. And who are they targeting? The LGBTQ population. It's just so sad. They have nothing to do with the cause of the bad feelings that exist in society at large, but they are being blamed, and that's called discrimination and stigmatization. So I've got some tables that just look at that population, but they don't break it out by locale. The population is way too small locally. It's really only available at the province as a whole. So it's a very small population with a very big harm component.
Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes left, so they need to be really short. It doesn't look like it. Maybe I'll turn it over to Kimberly or Lena just to close us out. Sure.
Karen, I think that Angel has her virtual hand up on the screen.
Oh, she does. Go ahead.
I'm
Angel.
sorry, I should have just piped up. Sorry about that. And this may not be a short answer, so if it's not, feel free to cut me off. But I was looking at your very helpful ethnicity table, and thank you for all of the work on this. In child welfare, we're always trying to look at overrepresentation and disparity. And so is it a fair characterization if I'm trying to establish for Lanark and for Leeds Grenville, the Indigenous population, to look at those areas where you've highlighted the primary Indigenous identification? So I think it was 6 and 7%.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's real. That's Stats Canada's numbers. That tells you the real number of people with Indigenous identity in those areas. And for sure, from a child welfare point of view, if you're looking at the percentage, the degree of overrepresentation, if 12% of your protection caseload is coming from an area with 6%, then you know it's double the representation. So you need the baseline to figure out the degree of overrepresentation for sure. And you can certainly use those tables to reliably count that for you. And, you know, I noticed that Aaron talked about needing to know which tribal community, you're trying to figure out which tribal community was in your population. That tribal community would be on my raw data tables for Indigenous. You'll be able to locate that, I think.
That's great. Thank you very much. That does answer my question.
Okay.
Well, Bob, I started off by saying that I'm the person that usually rolls her eyes at data, but I'm very excited about having this data, this set of this extensive set of data that you pulled together for us, because I really do think it's going to help position every kid in our community to, and our organizations individually, to be able to respond more effectively to our communities. So my head is spinning, and I think I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time taking that deep dive into the data charts to try and sort through what the impact is for our organization and what we can do. So I just wanted to thank you for the enormous amount of work that you did this last few months on this, and our data committee for nudging and pushing and prodding us to make sure that this happened. So, and those people that joined us that don't normally, welcome, and hope to see you again soon. And I think that we're finishing right at 11:30, which is quite a feat. So again, thanks everybody for attending, and we hope to see you over the summer, and be safe, be well out there.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.